Emily Carter woke up early that chilly autumn morning in Chicago, just as she did every day. The alarm clock hadn't even gone off yet, but she was used to waking up before it did, anxious and preoccupied with the demanding routine that lay ahead. Her small one-bedroom house was modest but tidy. On the couch, neatly folded, was the uniform she'd wear to work at the local restaurant. In the adjoining room, Sophie, her 6-year-old daughter, still slept soundly, her serene, angelic face softly illuminated by the weak light filtering through the worn curtains. Emily paused for a moment at the bedroom door, gazing at her daughter with a smile that was equal parts love and concern. Sophie was her entire world. Ever since Emily had decided to escape an abusive relationship with Richard Bennett, Sophie's father, she had known her life would never be easy again. But she also knew it was worth it. Every laugh from Sophie, every moment they shared, was a reminder that she had made the right choice, even if it meant facing daily struggles. Life wasn't easy for Emily. Her days began early and ended late. She worked as a waitress, relying on tips that barely covered rent and utilities. Often, she sacrificed her own needs to ensure Sophie had food, clothing, and occasionally a small gift to make her smile. Yet Emily never complained. For her, Sophie's happiness was her utmost priority. That particular morning, Emily left the coffee brewing on the small stove while she prepared Sophie's lunch for school. The weight of piling bills and tough decisions loomed over her, but she never let it show in front of her daughter. When Sophie finally woke up and ran into the kitchen, hugging her mother from behind, Emily knelt down to return the embrace, holding her tightly. "Good morning, my love," Emily said, kissing the top of Sophie's head. "Are you ready to conquer the world today?" "Yes, Mommy. I'm going to show my teacher the drawing I made yesterday. She said we can hang it in the classroom." Sophie's smile lit up the kitchen, and Emily felt a warmth in her chest that momentarily pushed away her worries. Emily and Sophie had a special after-school ritual. Whenever the weather allowed, they would walk to the small park at the end of their street. It wasn't a grand park with fancy equipment, just a simple place with a worn slide and swings that creaked at the slightest movement. For Sophie, however, it was the perfect setting for adventures and stories born from her vivid imagination. For Emily, it was a haven where she could see her daughter simply being a child, free from the burdens and limitations life imposed. That day, after rushing out of work, Emily picked Sophie up from school, and they headed to the park together. Sophie ran ahead, her light backpack bouncing as her brown curls caught the last rays of sunlight. Emily followed, marveling at how Sophie could turn something so mundane into a magical experience. "Mommy, look, I'm going to swing so high I'll touch the sky," Sophie shouted as she climbed onto the swing. Emily laughed as she sat down on a nearby bench. She crossed her arms to shield herself from the cold wind and continued watching Sophie with tenderness. These were the moments when she felt a bittersweet mix of joy and fear. Joy because Sophie seemed so carefree and happy. Fear because Emily knew how fragile that freedom truly was. With their financial struggles and the constant threat of Richard coming back into their lives, Emily often felt like she was standing on the edge of losing everything that mattered. When Sophie finally hopped off the swing and ran toward her, she held a handful of flowers she had picked from the grass nearby. "These are for you, Mommy, because you're the best in the world," Sophie said with a beaming smile as she handed Emily the flowers. Emily took them, and despite the slightly crumpled petals, they seemed like the most beautiful flowers she had ever received. She pulled Sophie onto her lap and hugged her tightly, inhaling the sweet scent of her daughter's hair. "You're the reason for everything, Sophie. Never forget that," Emily whispered. Sophie looked up at her with a curious expression, but before she could ask anything, Emily changed the subject, suggesting it was time to head home. The streets were already starting to grow dark, and Emily knew they needed to have dinner and rest for another busy day. That night, as she tucked Sophie into bed, Emily's mind wandered to the past, something that always seemed to happen when the house grew quiet. Sophie was wrapped in her blanket. Her small body relaxed against the pillows as Emily read a story about a girl who found courage in the face of adversity. When Sophie finally closed her eyes, Emily lingered for a few more minutes, watching her daughter and reflecting on everything she had endured to keep her safe. Life with Richard Bennett had started like a fairy tale. He was charming, successful, and seemed to hold all the answers to the dreams Emily, then a young woman brimming with hope, didn't know how to achieve on her own. But Richard's shine faded quickly. The charm that had won her over turned into control, and the security he had promised gave way to fear. Emily vividly remembered the nights she stayed up crying while Richard criticized her for not being able to keep up with it, or belittled her ambitions of having a career of her own. When Sophie was born, Emily hoped their daughter's arrival would change him. But the truth was even crueler. He became more distant, making it clear that he didn't want to be burdened with parental responsibilities. He never attended a doctor's appointment, never held Sophie when she cried, and never truly acted like a father. The breaking point came on an especially terrible night. Richard, after losing his temper over something trivial, yelled at Emily in a way that made Sophie, then just 2 years old, burst into uncontrollable tears. That sound was like a final alarm for Emily. She realized that if she stayed in that situation, not only her life but Sophie's life would also be at risk. In the middle of the night, Emily packed a few clothes into a suitcase, picked Sophie up from her crib, and left without looking back. The first few months were incredibly tough, but she managed to find a small shelter in Chicago and, eventually, a job. Since then, every single day had been a struggle to build a stable life for herself and her daughter. Now, sitting alone in the bedroom, Emily felt a heavy weight in her chest. Although Richard hadn't shown any interest in Sophie in recent years, she knew he was still a threat. His name was still on Sophie's birth certificate, and Emily lived in constant fear that one day he might use it to interfere in their lives. She gently squeezed Sophie's hand and murmured a promise, almost like a prayer. "I will never let anyone hurt you. Never." Richard's return came like an unexpected storm, leaving Emily completely blindsided. It was an ordinary afternoon, and she was in the middle of her shift at the restaurant when she saw an elegant and confident man walk through the door. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase, looking like he'd just stepped out of an important meeting. Emily didn't need a second glance to recognize Richard. Her heart raced, and for a moment, her hands trembled as she held the tray. He spotted her immediately and walked toward her with a smile that, to anyone else, might have seemed genuine. But Emily knew what lay behind that expression: calculation and manipulation. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure as he stopped just a few steps away. "Emily," he said, his voice low and laced with a false tone of friendliness. "Can we talk?" She glanced around, noticing the curious looks from some customers and co-workers. This wasn't the place for a scene, so she nodded silently and motioned to a table in the corner of the restaurant. He followed her, and as they sat down, Emily felt the weight of the past crashing down on her like an avalanche. "What are you doing here, Richard?" she asked, trying to sound more confident than she felt. He placed the briefcase on the table and clasped his hands together, leaning forward slightly. "I'm here for Sophie. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I believe it's time for me to be part of her life. It's not fair for you to keep her from having a father." Those words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She needed a moment to process them before responding. "Part of her life?" she scoffed, her laugh devoid of humor. "You had years to be part of her life, Richard, and you never cared. Why now?" He averted his gaze briefly, as if rehearsing his response, before looking back at her. "I've changed, Emily," he said. "I can give her everything she needs. A good home, top-notch education, stability. And I'm prepared to fight for it if I have to." Emily's world seemed to collapse as he spoke those words. She knew Richard had the resources and charisma to make good on his threat. In the eyes of a judge, His financial stability could easily outweigh the years of sacrifice and devotion she had poured into raising Sophie. Before she could reply, a customer called for her, forcing her to step away. As she worked, she tried to focus, but Richard's words echoed in her mind. When she returned to the table, he was already gone, leaving behind a business card with his lawyer's contact information. That night, after putting Sophie to bed, Emily cried silently. The threat she had always feared had finally arrived, and she knew she needed to be ready for what lay ahead. The family court in Chicago was a cold and impersonal place. The gray walls, rows of wooden chairs, and oppressive silence made Emily feel as though she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Beside her sat Lisa Harper, a public defender who had taken on her case with a mix of determination and skepticism. Lisa had handled cases like Emily's before and knew how tough this battle would be. On the other side of the room, Richard sat with his lawyer, a tall, self-assured man in an expensive suit, wearing a confident smile that seemed to declare victory before the proceedings had even begun. Emily tried not to look at them, but it was impossible to ignore the stark contrast. While she wore the only decent blazer she owned, borrowed from a friend, Richard appeared immaculate, like someone who had already won. "Emily, remember what we discussed?" Lisa whispered, leaning toward her. "Be honest, but stay calm. He'll try to provoke you." Emily nodded, clasping her trembling hands in her lap. A knot in her throat tightened with every passing second. When Judge Thomas Harrington entered the courtroom, everyone rose. He was a stern-looking man with gray hair and an expression that betrayed no emotion. Seated in his elevated chair, he glanced briefly at the papers before him and then began the proceedings. Richard was the first to speak. His lawyer presented a carefully constructed narrative, highlighting Richard's professional success, his ability to provide Sophie with a comfortable life, and the importance of a father figure in her upbringing. He also didn't miss the opportunity to imply that Emily, while devoted, lacked the financial and emotional stability to offer the same. Emily felt each word like a knife, but she maintained her composure. When it was her turn, Lisa made sure to emphasize the deep bond between Emily and Sophie. She presented letters from Sophie's school, where teachers described her as happy and well cared for, and even shared photos that captured moments of their life together. Emily also spoke directly to the judge, her voice trembling but filled with conviction. "Everything I've done has been for Sophie. I may not have much, but she has all of me. There is nothing in this world I wouldn't do for her." The hardest moment came when Richard's lawyer took the floor to question Emily. He tried to discredit her, pointing out her tight financial situation and questioning why she had never attempted to involve Richard in Sophie's life before. Emily felt her face flush, but she responded firmly, "I never tried because he never wanted to. Because I knew his presence would bring more pain than help." The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. When the hearing was adjourned for deliberation, Emily left the courtroom feeling drained and vulnerable. Outside, Sophie was waiting with a family friend. When she saw her mother, she ran into her arms, and Emily held her tightly, trying not to cry. Emily woke in the middle of the night, the silence of the house broken only by the distant sound of cars passing on the street. She sat up in bed, feeling the weight of the past weeks in every muscle of her body. Ever since the custody battle had begun, sleep had been a rare luxury. The uncertainty about Sophie's future was a constant nightmare, but tonight something felt different. The memory of what had happened in court haunted her with overwhelming intensity. She crept downstairs, careful not to wake Sophie. In the kitchen, she set water to boil and made herself a cup of tea. Sitting at the table, she stared at the warm light of the lamp reflecting off the worn walls and felt a pang of despair. What else could she do? Richard had all the resources, all the seemingly convincing arguments on his side. She knew that in a world governed by cold, objective rules, love and dedication often weren't enough. Yet, as she held the warm cup in her hands, something inside her refused to give up. Her mind drifted back to the early days after fleeing Richard. Back then, she had also thought she wouldn't survive, but she had. For Sophie, she had found strength she never imagined she possessed. And now she needed to summon that strength again. The next morning, while making breakfast, Emily noticed Sophie watching her with a serious, curious expression. The little girl was holding a drawing she had made the night before, showing the two of them hand in hand in front of a small but colorful house. "Are you sad, Mommy?" Sophie asked in her soft voice, her eyes locked onto Emily's. Emily knelt down in front of her daughter, taking her small hands in her own. "No, my love. I'm just thinking about how we can stay together, always. I want to stay with you." "I don't like that man," Sophie said bluntly, surprising Emily. "Who told you that, Sophie?" Emily asked cautiously. "He told me he has a big house with lots of toys." "But I don't want toys, Mommy. I just want you." Sophie's words lit a spark inside Emily. She realized that despite all the battles, there was still one thing Richard couldn't have: Sophie's heart. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to make a judge understand what truly mattered. Later that day, Emily returned to Lisa's office with renewed determination. Sitting across from a stack of papers Lisa was organizing, Emily spoke with conviction. "Sophie knows what she wants. No toy or big house can replace what she feels here with me. We need to show that to the judge." Lisa looked at her with a faint smile, as if noticing a newfound fire in Emily's eyes. "Then let's work on that. It won't be easy, but I think you're right. We'll do this the most honest way possible." The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension and hope. Emily and Lisa began to build a strategy to revisit the case, focusing on Sophie's emotional perspective. However, they both knew that wouldn't be enough without concrete evidence to challenge the perfection Richard claimed to offer. Emily decided it was time to take a more proactive role. While Lisa handled the legal side, Emily spent her free hours learning about her rights as a mother and ways to strengthen her case. Many nights were spent reading legal articles online and listening to family law podcasts. She also started talking to close friends, seeking any details that could be used to challenge Richard's seemingly flawless facade. It was during one of those conversations that Emily received an unexpected lead. Claire Mason, her longtime friend, mentioned something that changed everything. "Emily, I don't know if this helps," Claire said, her tone dropping to a near whisper, "but did you know that Richard has been traveling a lot lately? A friend of mine works at the same firm, and she mentioned that he barely has time to breathe. Doesn't sound like someone who could make room to care for a child, does it?" Claire's words lingered in Emily's mind. If true, this could directly contradict Richard's narrative of stability and commitment. Emily shared the information with Lisa, who immediately began investigating. Meanwhile, Emily stayed focused on Sophie, ensuring she didn't feel overwhelmed or too involved in the conflict. One afternoon, as she helped Sophie with her homework, the little girl drew a big heart on her paper and wrote, "I love you, Mommy." Emily felt tears well up in her eyes but masked them with a smile. The new hearing date arrived, and Emily entered the courtroom with her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. Lisa took a more assertive approach this time. She presented a detailed report of Richard's frequent travels and how they could negatively impact Sophie's emotional stability. Lisa also introduced statements from Sophie, provided with Emily's consent, in which the girl clearly expressed her wish to stay with her mother. For the first time, Richard seemed unsettled. His lawyer attempted to deflect, arguing that the trips were essential for his job and that he had plans to adjust his schedule. Still, the unwavering confidence Richard had displayed before was noticeably shaken. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she stood and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion, "I may not have everything Richard has, but Sophie has something with me that no big house can provide. Unconditional love, emotional security, and the promise that I will always be present for her. She needs a home, not an empty promise." The judge listened carefully, taking notes as Lisa concluded her arguments with newfound vigor. When the hearing ended, Emily felt, for the first time, that there might be a real chance of victory. After the hearing, the tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Emily returned home with Sophie, trying to keep their routine as normal as possible. She cooked dinner, talked about school, and read a bedtime story before tucking Sophie in. But as soon as Sophie closed her eyes, Emily felt the weight of her repressed emotions wash over her. What if the judge didn't believe her? What if all her struggles were for nothing? The next morning, Lisa called with unexpected news. The judge had ordered a home visit before making a final decision. Emily was torn between relief and anxiety. On one hand, she knew her home was simple but warm, a genuine reflection of what she and Sophie had built together. On the other, she feared Richard would use the opportunity to reinforce his narrative of financial superiority. In the days leading up to the visit, Emily did everything she could to prepare her home. She tidied up Sophie's toys, cleaned every corner, and even sewed a new curtain for the living room window using inexpensive fabric she'd bought on sale. Sophie, excited by the activity, helped her mom organize books and created little posters to hang on the walls. On one, she wrote, "Our house is full of love." Emily smiled at the sight of it but felt a pang of worry. Would that be enough? The day of the visit arrived, and Emily once again found herself face-to-face with Judge Harrington, though this time he was dressed casually. He was accompanied by a social worker, both of them wearing neutral expressions as they observed the space. Sophie, not fully grasping the gravity of the situation, greeted them with a smile and handed the judge one of her drawings. He accepted the gift with a polite nod but maintained his professionalism, carefully examining every detail of the home. "Can you tell us a little about your daily routine with Sophie?" the social worker asked, jotting down notes as she spoke. Emily took a deep breath before answering, describing their days, starting early with breakfast together, Sophie's schoolwork, her shifts at the restaurant, and the precious moments she set aside to play with her daughter or read to her before bedtime. Sophie, full of enthusiasm, interrupted several times to add details about their trips to the park and the cakes Emily baked on weekends. When the visit ended, the judge thanked Emily for her hospitality and left without revealing much about his thoughts. Emily closed the door and hugged Sophie tightly, trying to convince herself that she had done everything she could. But the relief was short-lived. The next day, Lisa called again. "Emily, I just got an update. Richard is challenging the validity of the home visit. He's claiming that you only prepared the house to impress the judge and that it doesn't reflect your actual living conditions." Lisa's words hit Emily like a punch. Even after everything, Richard still found ways to undermine her. But instead of succumbing to fear, Emily felt something different this time. A controlled anger, accompanied by a growing determination. "He can claim whatever he wants," Emily replied firmly. "But who we are here, every single day, isn't something he can erase with lies." Lisa paused, perhaps taken aback by Emily's confident tone, before responding. "That's exactly what we need to show in court. Who you and Sophie truly are." Days after the home visit, Emily received a summons for another hearing. The anxiety grew with each passing moment, but she knew she had to stay calm. Lisa worked tirelessly, reviewing every detail of the case and preparing Emily for any tough questions she might face in court. Despite all the preparation, Emily couldn't shake one persistent thought. What if Richard managed to manipulate them again? On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom was more crowded than usual. Richard arrived accompanied by his lawyer and his new wife, an elegant woman who seemed handpicked to bolster the image of the perfect family. Emily felt a knot in her stomach at the sight of them, but she looked over at Lisa, who gave her a reassuring nod. Judge Harrington opened the session with his usual serious and objective tone. The first part of the debate centered on Richard's allegations about the home visit. His lawyer argued that Emily had manipulated the conditions to appear more organized and stable than she truly was. Lisa, however, countered firmly. "Your Honor, what we saw in Ms. Carter's home was the genuine representation of a mother who, despite financial limitations, prioritizes the well-being and emotional development of her daughter. This isn't about luxury. It's about love, stability, and daily dedication." As Lisa's words echoed through the courtroom, Emily studied the judge's face, hoping to catch some hint of how he was processing the arguments. He remained impassive, scribbling notes in his pad. The most impactful moment of the hearing came when Sophie was called to testify privately, with only the judge, a court-appointed psychologist, and the attorneys present. Emily waited outside the room, wringing her hands nervously, while Lisa tried to reassure her. "Sophie is brilliant, Emily. She knows what she wants. Trust her." When Sophie emerged from the room, she immediately ran into Emily's arms, and that simple act was enough to soothe some of her mother's anxiety. Lisa later revealed that Sophie's testimony had been clear and heartfelt. Sophie wanted to stay with her mom. The psychologist confirmed that the emotional bond between them was undeniable and that Sophie seemed completely secure and happy with Emily. On the other hand, Richard attempted to redirect the focus to his own efforts, listing the advantages he could offer Sophie. He spoke of private schools, travel opportunities, and experiences he claimed were beyond Emily's reach. But there was something less confident in his demeanor. Perhaps he realized Sophie's sincerity had shaken his strategy. At the end of the day, the judge announced he would need more time to review all the evidence and testimonies before making a final decision. Emily left the courtroom feeling a mixture of hope and uncertainty, but something in her heart told her there was a real chance of victory. The wait for the judge's decision was agonizing. Emily tried to maintain her usual routine, but each day felt like an endless wait. At work, she made small mistakes because of her distraction, and at home, she tried not to show her nervousness, hoping to keep Sophie from worrying. Despite her efforts, Sophie sensed her mother's tension and countered it with sweet gestures. A drawing left on the table, an unexpected hug, or a whispered "I love you" before bedtime. On the other side, Richard was restless. He had underestimated Emily's emotional strength and, more importantly, the weight of Sophie's voice in the case. During a meeting with his lawyer, Richard questioned how the situation could be turned around. "She can't beat me," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "I have everything an ideal father needs. This can't be ignored." His lawyer maintained a calm, professional demeanor but reminded him that the court didn't base its decisions solely on material wealth. Sophie's testimony and the psychologist's evaluation had already given Emily an advantage that would be hard to challenge. Meanwhile, Emily used the waiting period to further strengthen her emotional defense. Lisa suggested she write a personal statement for the judge, something that would reflect her journey as a mother and her unwavering commitment to Sophie. Emily spent an entire night writing, revising, and crying as she poured her heart onto the page. When she finally finished, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. It was as if she had released years of fear, love, and struggle into a single letter. The day of the decision arrived. The courtroom was packed with people curious to hear the outcome. Emily entered with Sophie by her side, holding her hand tightly. Richard was already seated, his expression tense but attempting to maintain a confident facade. The atmosphere in the room was one of overwhelming anticipation. Judge Harrington began speaking, summarizing the key points of the case. He mentioned Richard's financial means, Sophie's emotional testimony, Emily's dedication, and the social worker's evaluation. His voice was steady, but each word carried a weight that made Emily's heart race. "This case is not about who can provide more material resources," the judge said, looking directly at Richard. "It's about what is in the best interest of the child, considering her emotional needs and the environment where she feels safest and most loved." The room was silent as the judge continued. "Based on the evidence presented, the psychological evaluations, and the testimony of the child. This court concludes that Sophie's best interests are served by remaining with her mother, Emily Carter. The words seemed to suspend time. It took Emily a few seconds to process what she had just heard. Then, tears streamed down her face as she turned to embrace Sophie, who smiled, still too young to fully grasp the magnitude of the moment, but happy to see her mother so overcome with joy. Richard remained silent, his expression hardened. It was clear he wasn't used to losing, and the weight of defeat hung visibly on him. His lawyer attempted to speak, but Richard simply shook his head, stood, and left the room without looking back. After the victory in court, Emily felt a mix of relief and disbelief. For the first time in months, she could take a deep breath without the constant weight of uncertainty. On the way home, walking hand in hand with Sophie, the world seemed to regain its colors. Sophie, beaming, clung tightly to her mother's hand, as if she intuitively understood the significance of the moment, even if the complexities of what had happened were beyond her grasp. "Mommy, everything's okay now, isn't it?" Sophie asked, her big, curious eyes gazing up at Emily. Emily stopped, knelt down on the sidewalk, and held Sophie's face gently. "Yes, my love. Everything is okay now. Nothing will ever separate us again." Sophie smiled and hugged her, and in that moment, Emily felt that every sacrifice had been worth it. In the days that followed, life began to return to normal, but Emily knew there was still a road ahead. Despite the court's decision, the emotional impact of the process didn't vanish overnight. She noticed this especially in Sophie, who seemed more attached than ever. Small gestures, like wanting to sleep in Emily's room or calling for her constantly, revealed that the little girl still felt afraid that things might change. Emily decided they needed a break. With Claire's help, she managed to plan a small weekend trip to Lake Michigan. It was a simple place, but one that held special meaning for them. Sophie loved playing in the sand, and Emily knew the sound of the waves and the fresh breeze would bring both of them a sense of peace. On Saturday morning, they packed a small bag and took the bus. When they arrived, Sophie ran to the lake's edge, laughing and splashing the water with her bare feet. Emily watched from a distance, sitting on a towel, letting the scene fill her heart with gratitude. "Mommy, come play with me," Sophie shouted, waving enthusiastically. Emily laughed, took off her shoes, and joined her. For a while, they forgot everything: the court, Richard, the struggles. It was just mother and daughter, laughing together under the sun. That night, as Sophie slept in her arms on the bus ride home, Emily stared out the window, reflecting on the future. She knew she'd have to keep fighting every day, but she also knew she was capable. When they arrived home, Sophie was already sleepy, and Emily carried her to bed. Before drifting off, Sophie murmured softly, "You're the best mommy in the world." Emily stayed by her side for a few minutes, holding her hand, as a silent tear ran down her cheek. In that moment, she made a promise to herself. She would no longer let fear dictate her life. The victory in court was just the beginning. Now, she wanted to build a life that was more than just survival, a life where Sophie could grow up free and happy. Returning to routine was harder than Emily had imagined. Despite her victory in court, practical issues couldn't be ignored. Bills continued to pile up, and the daily struggle to balance work and quality time with Sophie remained a constant challenge. Yet something in Emily had changed. The experience in court had made her realize her own strength, fueling a newfound determination to improve the life she was building with Sophie. One night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Emily sat at the table with a blank sheet of paper and began planning her next steps. She thought about how she could find a better job or even go back to school. Her long-buried dream of becoming a nurse now seemed within reach, despite years of sacrifices and prioritizing Sophie. With Claire's help, she started researching scholarship programs and night classes. At work, Emily also began to stand out. Her boss noticed her dedication and offered her a more stable shift, meaning fewer late nights and more time with Sophie. It was a small step, but it was enough to motivate her even more. At home, Sophie seemed to thrive. Her laughter was more frequent, and she chattered endlessly about her school friends and the drawings she wanted to make to decorate her room. The changes didn't go unnoticed by Claire, who visited Emily regularly. "You seem different, Emily." "Lighter," Claire remarked as they sipped coffee in the small kitchen. Emily smiled, fiddling with the ring on her finger. "I think it's because, for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're heading in the right direction. I don't know exactly how we'll get there, but I feel like we can." Claire reached out and held Emily's hand, a silent gesture of support. Still, the ghost of Richard hadn't disappeared completely. A few weeks after the court's decision, Emily received a letter from his lawyer. Although he had lost custody, Richard was now seeking supervised visitation rights. It was a request Emily knew she'd have to face. Sophie had the right to see her father, but how could Emily protect her daughter from further disappointment? Emily brought the letter to Lisa, who had become more than just her lawyer. She was now a trusted confidant. They sat together in a small office, analyzing the document. "He's trying to show that he's still present, even after everything," Lisa said. "This could be legitimate, but it might also be an attempt to maintain control." Emily felt a wave of exhaustion. It seemed like the fight would never end. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of worry. "You have options," Lisa said. "We can negotiate the terms of the visits and set clear boundaries. But you also need to decide if you're willing to face this again, for Sophie's sake." Emily left the office with more questions than answers. That night, as she watched Sophie play on the living room floor, she realized she'd have to make a decision soon. More than anything, she wanted to protect the happiness they had finally achieved. Emily spent the week reflecting on Richard's request. Memories of the past mixed with uncertainties about the future, creating a whirlwind of emotions she could barely control. What was truly fair for Sophie? As a mother, her instinct was to shield her daughter from any potential pain. However, she also knew that one day Sophie might want to understand who her father was and why he had been absent for so long. On Friday night, after putting Sophie to bed, Emily sat down with Claire to discuss the issue. "Do you think I'm wrong to hesitate?" Emily asked, holding a cup of tea in her hands, more for comfort than thirst. Claire shook her head, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think you're wrong. You have very valid reasons to protect Sophie. But I also think that denying her the chance to decide how she feels about Richard could be something she questions later in life." Emily looked at Claire, absorbing her words. The decision didn't feel any simpler, but something about what Claire said resonated. Perhaps it was possible to create a safe space for Sophie to interact with Richard, as long as the boundaries were clear. On Monday, Emily returned to Lisa's office. With newfound determination, she requested that a supervised visitation agreement be drafted, ensuring that Sophie would always be in a neutral environment with a mediator present. Lisa reviewed the conditions and approved Emily's careful approach. "This protects your daughter, but it also shows that you're willing to do what's best for her, even if it's hard for you." "That says a lot about your strength, Emily," Lisa said. The first supervised visit was scheduled for the following weekend at a community center. In the days leading up to it, Emily spent time talking to Sophie, explaining that she would have the chance to see her father. Sophie listened attentively but didn't seem particularly excited. "Will you stay with me, Mommy?" Sophie asked, her eyes wide. "I won't be in the room, but I'll be right outside, waiting for you," Emily replied, trying to sound confident. When the day arrived, Emily sat in the hallway while Sophie and Richard met for the first time since the trial. Her heart was racing, but she held her composure. Inside the room, Sophie seemed cautious. Richard tried to break the ice by showing her a toy he had brought, but Sophie clutched her favorite doll instead. "My mommy always plays with me," Sophie said simply. Richard looked visibly unsettled but tried to recover, telling stories about the house where he lived and the things he could do with Sophie in the future. The little girl listened but gave short responses. When the visit was over, Sophie ran back to Emily, who welcomed her with a tight hug. On the way home, Emily asked, "How was it, my love?" Sophie shrugged. "He seems nice, but I like being with you more." Emily smiled, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew the process would be long and that Sophie's feelings might evolve over time, but she was determined to ensure her daughter always had the final say in her relationship with Richard. The months that followed brought a new routine for Emily and Sophie. Supervised visits with Richard became regular but continued to be an emotional challenge for Emily. At each meeting, she struggled with the urge to shield Sophie from potential disappointment while trying to keep an open mind about what these visits might mean for her daughter's future. Sophie, for her part, approached the visits with the curiosity of a child still trying to understand what having a father in her life meant. Sometimes, she came back excited, sharing stories about the toys Richard had brought or the things he promised to do. Other times, she seemed distracted, quickly changing the subject when Emily asked about the visit. "He's different, Mommy," Sophie said one evening as she colored a drawing. "He talks a lot about big things, but I like the small things, like when we bake cakes together." Emily smiled, feeling both relieved and concerned. Sophie seemed to be forming her own opinions about Richard, a sign of her growing emotional independence. But Emily also knew Richard's promises could create expectations that might be hard to manage. One afternoon, after a supervised visit, Richard asked to speak with Emily. They stood in the community center parking lot while Sophie played with a monitor nearby. Keeping their distance, Emily crossed her arms, bracing herself for what he might say. "I want more time with Sophie," Richard said bluntly. "These supervised visits aren't enough." "She's my daughter too, Emily." Emily crossed her arms, feeling a wave of irritation rise within her. Still, she kept her composure. The court decided this is what's best for her right now. If you truly want to be part of her life, you need to prove that you're committed, and that doesn't happen overnight. Richard seemed taken aback by the firmness in her voice. For a moment he was silent, staring at the ground. "I'm not perfect, Emily. I know that, but I'm trying. I want to be a real father to her." Richard's words were unexpected, and as much as Emily wanted to doubt him, there was something in his tone that sounded sincere. Even so, she knew she couldn't let her guard down. Trying to be a father starts with respecting what's best for her. And right now, that means supervised visits. He nodded, albeit reluctantly, and walked away. Emily watched him leave, feeling a mix of doubt and resolve. No matter how much Richard might change, her focus remained on Sophie. Later that night, as she tucked Sophie into bed, Emily reflected on how much her life had changed. The past still lingered like a shadow, but for the first time, she felt in control. Sophie was her priority, and nothing would change that. "You're the best mommy in the world," Sophie murmured before drifting off to sleep, words that never failed to warm Emily's heart. Sitting beside her daughter's bed, Emily gazed out the window at the stars sparkling in the dark sky. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face whatever came her way, as long as Sophie was by her side. The end of the year arrived, bringing with it Chicago's characteristic chill and the festive celebrations that lit up the streets with joy. For Emily, this time of year always called for reflection. It was the first Christmas in a long time that she felt stable, even though challenges still loomed. Sophie, as cheerful as ever, spent her evenings decorating their small tree with ornaments they had saved over the years. One afternoon, as Emily wrapped simple gifts for Sophie, she received an unexpected call from Richard. His voice, hesitant, was different from the confident tone he usually used. "Emily," he began, "I know this is sudden, but I wanted to ask if maybe I could spend Christmas with Sophie, even if it's just for a little while." Emily froze, the roll of wrapping paper still in her hands. She wasn't sure how to respond. "Emily, I know this might seem like a strange request, but I'd like to spend Christmas with Sophie, just for a few hours. I promise to follow any conditions you set, Richard said. Emily remained silent for a few seconds, processing his request. Richard had never shown interest in being part of such personal moments before. She glanced out the window, where Sophie was playing in the snow with Claire, and felt the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. I need to think about it, Richard. This isn't just my decision. It's Sophie's too. I'll talk to her. After hanging up, Emily felt torn. On one hand, she feared exposing Sophie to something that could lead to unfulfilled expectations. On the other, she knew that denying this moment might become an issue later. When Sophie came inside, her cheeks red from the cold, Emily called her over for a conversation. My love, your dad called today. He asked if he could spend some time with you on Christmas. What do you think about that? Sophie furrowed her brow, thinking as she fiddled with her fingers. Will he come here, Mommy? No, sweetheart. It would be at a neutral place, and I'd be nearby in case you needed me. Sophie shrugged, not particularly enthusiastic but not opposed either. Okay, I guess. But you'll stay close, right? Emily assured her that she would, and they arranged to meet at a small cafe near the community center. On the scheduled day, Emily brought Sophie to the cafe, which was adorned with twinkling lights and festive wreaths. Richard was already there, seated at a table with 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate waiting for them. Sophie sat cautiously, studying Richard as if still trying to figure him out. He attempted to break the ice, pulling out a small, carefully wrapped gift. This is for you, Sophie. I hope you like it. Sophie opened the package with curiosity and found a unicorn puzzle, something he clearly knew she loved. She smiled but responded shyly. The conversation was light, with no big revelations or promises. Richard talked about his work and asked Sophie questions about school while Emily watched from a distance, ready to step in if needed. By the end, Sophie thanked him for the gift and returned to Emily's arms, ready to leave. On the way home, Sophie seemed thoughtful. He was nice today, Mommy, but I still think I like being just with you better. Emily smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand, her heart filled with a quiet mix of relief and acceptance. Emily laughed softly, holding her daughter's hand as they walked through the snow. And that's how it will always be, my love. You and me together. Winter gradually gave way to spring, and Emily's life seemed to bloom along with the season. She had enrolled in a night nursing course, a dream she had always held, and now balanced work, studies, and caring for Sophie with more confidence than ever. Sophie, for her part, appeared more secure and joyful, splitting her time between school activities, afternoons at the park, and cherished moments with her mom. Meanwhile, the supervised visits with Richard continued, though less frequently. He still brought gifts and tried to build a relationship with Sophie, but the changes Emily had hoped to see in his behavior seemed slow to materialize. Sophie, while polite and kind, maintained an emotional distance, preferring the constancy and comfort she found with her mother. One day, during a class at her nursing course, Emily received an unexpected call from Richard. His voice sounded more serious than usual, almost vulnerable. Emily, I need to talk to you. It's important. They agreed to meet at a cafe near the community center. When Emily arrived, she found Richard sitting alone, lacking the usual confidence he often carried. What's going on? She asked, taking a seat across from him. Richard sighed, running his hands through his hair. I've been thinking a lot about Sophie, about everything that's happened over the past few years. I know I've failed you both in so many ways, and I know I may never be able to fully make up for the lost time. But I want to do what's right for her. Emily studied him carefully, trying to gauge the sincerity in his words. What does that mean, Richard? He hesitated before replying. It means I'm not going to contest anything anymore. I won't interfere with what you believe is best for Sophie. I still want to be in her life, but only in ways that she's comfortable with. If that means fewer visits or just letters, I'll accept it. The most important thing is that she's happy. Richard's words took Emily by surprise. For years, She had waited for a gesture like this, something that showed he finally understood what it meant to be a father. If you really want to be part of her life, Richard, you need to understand that it's not about gifts or promises. It's about being consistently present and reliable. Sophie needs to trust you, and that takes time. Richard nodded, his expression more humble than Emily had ever seen. For the first time, she felt that he might truly be willing to change, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love for his daughter. The months that followed were marked by small but meaningful progress. Richard began sending letters to Sophie, which she read with curiosity and occasionally responded to with drawings. The visits became less frequent but more impactful, with moments where Sophie started to feel comfortable sharing parts of her life with him. That summer, Emily and Sophie decided to take a trip together to Lake Michigan, a place that had always brought them peace. Sitting on the sand, Sophie sketched in her notebook while Emily gazed at the horizon. "Mommy, I like how things are now," Sophie said suddenly. "Just the two of us. But with Daddy sometimes." Emily smiled, taking her daughter's hand. "And that's how it will be, my love. However, it works best for you." The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emily looked at Sophie and felt a wave of gratitude and relief. After everything they had endured, they were finally in a place of balance. A place where Sophie could grow up happy and free, surrounded by love, without the weight of the past.